Good morning. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jordan Ramalingam, and I'm a staff member in the Industrial Strategies Division at CARB. Thank you for joining us on day 3 of the 2022 Scoping Plan Kickoff Workshop Series. We'll be focusing on the transportation sector this morning, and we have an excellent lineup of panelists from several state agencies to share key findings from their work as well as next steps. So a couple of quick housekeeping items I'd like to mention before we get. So we are recording today's workshop, and we'll make the recording accessible through the Scoping Plan webpage after this workshop series concludes. All attendees are in listen-only mode, same format as the last 3 workshops. After all presentations, there will be an opportunity for public comments and questions. Attendees should use the raise hand button to indicate that they'd like to ask a question. And meeting organizers will call on and unmute attendees so they can ask their question or make a comment. Now, if we happen to run short on time today, or you want to follow up with written comments, there is a public comment docket open, and anyone may submit comments through July 9th, and we will read them. So let's get started. Next slide, please. Now, here's an overview of our agenda. Now, if you happened to catch the Natural Working Lands workshop yesterday morning, the format is roughly the same. So first, I'll provide a brief introduction of the workshop topic, transportation sector. Then we'll have a panel of 4 speakers from different agencies who will be introduced shortly. After our panelist presentations, we'll take public comments, as I mentioned, as well as questions from attendees. And lastly, we will close with information on the Scoping Plan development schedule and where to find additional information so you can stay engaged in that update process. Next slide, please. So today's focus area workshop is intended to build on the day 1 workshop. So on day 1, we heard brief presentations from the authors of the AB 74 carbon neutrality reports, which examined strategies to scale down supply and demand for fossil fuels and reach carbon neutrality by mid-century. Today, we'll get the opportunity to dive deeper into specific aspects of transportation decarbonization with presentations on vehicle technology mixes by mid-century, EV charging rates, refueling infrastructure funding, and investment in developing sustainable communities to drive down vehicle miles traveled. As I mentioned, we've also carved out time in the agenda to hear from all of you attending today, and we'll pose some suggested questions for feedback as well. And as we are just commencing the update process, we especially look forward to hearing your input as we work toward building various carbon neutrality scenarios to analyze and to ultimately recommend a scoping plan scenario to present to our board for adoption by the end of next year. Next slide. Now, if you watched the workshops on days 1 and 2, you're probably getting very tired of this slide, but bear with us for the sake of anyone that is tuning in for the first time. I think it's important to define the scope of what carbon neutrality means. So to date, we've focused on limiting emissions from burning fossil fuels and releases of high GWP gases. In planning for carbon neutrality, this means that all sources of emissions are balanced by carbon sinks by mid-century. Fossil fuel production and consumption has induced the climate-related problems we now face, so the first priority remains minimizing combustion of fossil fuels and driving down emissions from the other sources as much as possible. But we also need to develop and utilize carbon sinks. And this includes both engineered technologies as well as naturally occurring carbon removal in our natural and working lands. However, as depicted, natural and working lands are listed as both a source and a sink. And we heard on Wednesday especially about how recent catastrophic wildfires and land conversion and other disturbances that are largely driven by climate change and human activity have turned our natural and working lands into a net source of emissions which makes achieving carbon neutrality even more challenging. Next slide. So, focusing on the transportation sector, that's our topic for this morning. Many of you are aware the transportation sector is the largest contributor to the statewide greenhouse gas inventory. Makes up 41% of greenhouse gas emissions from vehicle tailpipes alone, and around 50% total when you account for refining and oil production emissions. But transportation is also responsible for 3/4 of statewide NOx emissions, which of course is a precursor for smog, as well as a significant contributor to toxic emissions like diesel particulate matter. With a recent executive order, Governor Newsom established a goal of rapidly electrifying on and off-road transportation modes in the near future, including a target of 100% zero-emission vehicle sales for passenger vehicles by 2035. Electrifying transportation will provide enormous greenhouse gas and air quality benefits for the state, particularly for those living in high-traffic freight hubs or in close proximity to freeways. But it requires careful planning and substantial public and private investment to ensure that the vehicles and the refueling infrastructure are both available and affordable for all Californians. Electrification won't happen overnight either. So we also need to continue investing in alternative fuels to displace petroleum in existing internal combustion engine vehicles, as well as pursuing actions that reduce vehicle miles traveled. Next slide. So with this framework in mind, here are 4 example questions. These serve as examples of the types of questions we should be exploring in this scoping plan. So first, where should we focus public investment to help facilitate the transition to transportation electrification? Next, how do we ensure that low-income residents have equal access to affordable, clean vehicles and refueling infrastructure? How closely should reduction in demand for petroleum fuels match reduction in supply? And should we be concerned about increased crude imports if we don't phase down supply and demand in a coordinated fashion? And lastly, what are the most promising approaches for reducing vehicle miles traveled and single occupant vehicle trips, especially for non-work related travel? Next slide. So with that, I'd like to move to our first panel presentation. Sam Pornazeri, I welcome you to join and turn on your video. Sam is Chief of the Mobile Source Analysis Branch at CARB, and he will start us off with an overview of the 2020 Mobile Source Strategy, which examines technology mixes needed for deep decarbonization of the transportation sector. Sam, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Jordan. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. If we can start from the first slide. All right, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today for the 3rd day of our public workshop on development of the 2022 Scoping Plan Update. As Jordan said, I'm Sam Pornazeri, Chief of the Mobile Source Analysis Branch at CARB. I oversee the development of the Mobile Source Strategy. I'm very glad for having the opportunity to speak to you today on the California's vision for zero-emission transportation. Next slide. So this is I'm gonna wait for, okay. So this is slide has some animation and I'll let you know to click through it. But first, let me start by saying that the state of California has an ambitious suite of clean air requirements and climate goals that we're working to meet over the next 30 years. Some of those mentioned by Jordan earlier on. The graphic here shows the various state implementation plan attainment years for South Coast and San Joaquin Valley, the 2 areas in the state with the most challenging ozone and fine particulate air quality. If you click, there's also an immediate need to reduce emission and exposure in state highly impacted low-income and disadvantaged communities in 2024 and 2025. Another click. And last but not least, climate goals include the midterm target in 2030 for 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels, and longer term targets in 2045 for an economy-wide carbon neutrality. And by 2050, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by almost 80% below 1990 levels. Next slide. So let me start by, sounds like, okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. Let me start by providing an overview of the contribution of mobile sources in California, or the transportation sector, in other words. So reducing transportation emissions from transportation sector is really key for achieving our clean air goals. This is mainly because the mobile sources and fossil fuels that are powering them continue to contribute to the majority of emissions of nitrogen oxides, a significant precursor to smog and particulate matter problems in our state, and are the largest portion of GHG emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions, in California. The chart on the right shows 2020 statewide NOx emissions as derived from our most recent planning inventory, with mobile sources representing almost 76% of the total emissions. And the pie chart on the left here shows 2018 statewide GHG emission inventory, where transportation sector represent 40% of the total emissions. Next slide. So before I jump into the strategies, I want to again reiterate something that we heard earlier from Jordan. Last September, recognition of the severity of the climate crisis and the need for immediate action, Governor Newsom signed Executive Order N7920, which established a first-in-the-nation goal for 100% of California's sales of new passenger cars and trucks to be zero emission by 2035. The governor's order also set a goal to transition all drayage trucks and all off-road equipment to zero emission by 2035, and the remainder of medium and heavy-duty vehicles to zero emission by 2045. On behalf of CARB, we're committed to achieving these goals and are looking forward to working with both industry and various levels of government to introduce and demonstrate the technology and help commercializing it. Next slide. So as required by the Senate Bill 44, which was authored by Senator Skinner, CARB is required to update its mobile source strategy every 5 years and evaluate opportunities for advanced technology deployment and emission reductions to meet state various clean air goals. The 2020 mobile source strategy, or what we call it as MSS, take a conceptual approach and consists of scenarios and technology trajectories for various mobile source sectors in the state that are needed in order to meet our numerous air quality, climate, and near source exposure goals that I just described earlier. These strategies recognize the control programs that are already in development, as well as newly identified regulatory incentive concepts that will help us to move forward. I would like to emphasize that while the scenario concepts in the mobile source strategy outline the overall approach for the mobile source technology and include program concepts that will move the state in the needed direction, the specific strategy for each sector will continue to be refined. Next slide. So before I jump into the scenario modeling work, I would like to say that we are keenly aware that emissions from mobile sources have a disproportionate impact on low-income communities, communities of color, and many of whom who live in close proximity to transportation corridors. The scenario and concepts in the 2020 strategy, especially those covering the freight sector, have the potential to significantly reduce emissions and exposure in communities of concern. The strategies seek rapid transition to zero-emission technologies statewide across numerous sectors, but we know that we need to act even more quickly and target the introduction of those zero-emission vehicles in communities that for generations have been bearing the brunt of combustion emissions. Next slide. So here's a glimpse at the technology mixes that are assumed in the 2020 mobile source strategy. Our scenarios for passenger cars assumed 100% zero emission and plug-in hybrid vehicles starting in 2035, along with 15% reduction in statewide light-duty VMT by 2050. For heavy-duty trucks, we assumed 100% of California fleet purchases to be zero emission starting in 2035, and combined that with cleaner combustion in the near term. For other types of equipment that we referred here to as off-road equipment, we modeled full transition to zero-emission technology by 2035 for smaller equipment like forklifts. And for heavier off-road equipment like locomotives, ships, and etc., we modeled scenarios with zero-emission technology application where feasible and cleaner combustion combined with low-carbon fuels in hard-to-electrify sectors. Next slide. So now let us take a look at an example of our scenarios for passenger vehicles. To achieve our ambitious emission reduction targets, 100% light-duty vehicle sales in 2035 should be plug-in hybrid and zero emissions. This is also in line with the governor's executive order, the recent governor's executive order. With this target in mind, the resulting technology population fractions are shown with battery electric vehicles in light brown, hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles shown in light blue, plug-in hybrids in lighter green, and gasoline vehicles shown in dark blue. Given the aggressive nature of cells before 2035, up to 8 million zero-emission vehicles and plug-in hybrids would be in the fleet by 2030, well above the California's governor's second ZEV target. This reflects the more aggressive climate target that we're currently considering compared to when the governor established the 5 million ZEV target. Even with this scenario, there still remains a fraction of the fleet that use internal combustion engines in 2050. Next slide. In the heavy-duty space, the mobile source strategy scenario assumes a complete transition to zero-emission truck sales by 2035 for Californian-based trucks. Our current scenario modeling is showing around 830 heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles statewide. As shown, to meet our air quality goals, we are envisioning those trucks that are not zero-emission will be powered by the cleanest combustion technology. As discussed earlier, Governor Newsom's recent executive order calls for 100% of in-state medium and heavy-duty trucks and buses to be zero-emission by 2045. This means that we certainly need to double down on our efforts to transition this sector to zero-emission. CARB is developing a zero-emission fleet regulation with the goal of achieving a zero-emission truck and bus California fleet by 2045, everywhere feasible, and significantly earlier for certain market segments such as last-mile delivery or drayage application. The initial focus would be on high priority fleets with vehicles that are suitable for early electrification, their subhaulers, and entities that hire them. The goal of this effort to accelerate the number of medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle purchases to achieve a full transition to zero emission vehicle in California as soon as possible. Next slide. So with these scenarios in mind, the vehicle fleet will substantially transition to zero emission vehicles by 2045. However, as I mentioned earlier, even with non-zero emission vehicle sales phased out by 2035, 30% of passenger vehicle in the fleet will still have a gas-powered engine in 2045. That means that VMT reduction will be necessary to directly and immediately help with attainment of our air quality standards and bring the light-duty sector within striking distance of carbon neutrality. Beyond tailpipe emissions, historic decision-making supporting single occupancy vehicle travel has shaped our communities, leaving California in search of an affordable place to live and with insufficient transportation options too often left with little choice but to spend significant time and money commuting long distances. Housing and transportation decisions also reinforce long-standing racial economic injustices. And land use and transportation decisions where they involve or incentivize conversion of natural and working land also impedes California's ability to store carbon and maintain resilient ecosystems and the life-sustaining resources they provide. Clearly, ZEVs cannot solve all of these problems. We need to re-envision the transportation system to provide real, viable mobility options other than single occupancy vehicles. Next slide. Of course, a key piece of the transition to zero-emission technology is the infrastructure needed to facilitate it. We know that the streamlined process that allows for massive infrastructure build-out is necessary to enable introduction of zero-emission technology in various sectors. Over the development of the mobile source strategy, we have been working very closely with our sister agency, such as California Energy Commission and CPUC, to evaluate the specific what is needed to support such transition. Luckily, two of my colleagues at Caltrans and CEC, as well as CPUC, will be here to talk about the infrastructure and the VMT reductions. Next slide. So altogether, the concept layout in the 2020 mobile source strategy gives us very significant reduction in air pollution statewide, resulting in a 66% reduction in diesel particulate matter in 2031 relative to 2017 levels, also an 82% reduction in NOx in 2037. In the climate space, we get significantly lower emissions, about 76% below the 2020 baseline. A large percentage of the fleet in 2045 will be zero emission, 85% of passenger car will be zero, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and 77% of heavy-duty vehicle will be zero emission in 2045. Next slide. So just to elaborate a little bit more on the development process, this slide shows the overview of the process for how a concept evolved. Things included in the 2020 mobile source strategy or other similarly high-level planning documents start as a concept, and that's the first row. And as CARB staff engages with the public and stakeholders, the concept can be further defined into measure. As the process continues and program staff at CARB further develop a concept, it goes through a formal rulemaking process, including draft rule, economic and environmental analysis, technology assessment, public workshop, and hearing prior to being adopted by the board and for CARB to enforce those requirements. Keep in mind, while this process is almost never a straight line, and the public engagement for a regulation or a program in many cases happening simultaneous to development of the mobile source strategy or other plans, it usually can take anywhere between 5 to 10 years from start to finish. Next slide. So with that, I would like to end my presentation by saying that we are ambitious and working toward a future with zero emission technology that are fueled with low carbon fuels and carbon-free electricity, along with sustainable transportation system, which will result in more vibrant and healthier communities. California's ability to remain an economic powerhouse as well as an environmental leader really requires additional efforts to improve transportation sustainability, including transitioning to zero emission transportation. Next slide. So here you can find my contact information as well as links to programs and executive orders that are referenced throughout my presentation. With that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening. Back to you, Jordan.
Great, thank you, Sam, so much. Next up, we have Paul Phillips. Paul is the Program Supervisor of the Retail Rates Group at the California Public Utilities Commission. Paul will be discussing considerations associated with designing electricity rates for EV charging. So Paul, go ahead and unmute yourself, and if you can turn your video on, that would be great as well. And the floor is yours. And Paul, we can see you, but we can't hear you yet. Paul, go ahead and click the unmute button. It should be right above your video icon. There we go.
Okay, for some reason it was taking a few tries. It was telling me that you needed to unmute me, but thank you. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak at the workshop here, and just kind of wanted to spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes walking through current events as it pertains to electric vehicle rates at the California Public Utilities Commission, some recent developments in electric vehicle rates, and generally kind of the overarching environment currently that we find ourselves in that is requiring us to move forward with more advanced EV rate designs in the future, and to balance some critical policy goals in the meantime. So next slide, please. So I wanted to start with kind of a backdrop of where we stand today with regard to household energy costs and affordability as we move into a more electrified environment in the state of California to meet our 2045 goals. We know that in broad strokes that the household energy costs and rates are rising disproportionately at the moment and impacting affordability for low to moderate income Californians, particularly in our hotter climate zones. what this really means too is that the bundled residential rates have long outstripped inflation. Really, for the past 7 years, 8 years, our IOUs are gradually climbing in national rankings as average residential bills increase year over year. It's something to keep an eye on, of course, and we're doing what we can to begin thinking about how that's going to look in the future, particularly with wildfire costs rising. Wildfire mitigation plan costs over the next decade are going to escalate rather rapidly in the tens of billions of dollars for us throughout the state. So another kind of key point here is that net energy metering and distributed energy resource customers tend to be disproportionately wealthier homeowners that can arbitrage, if you will, different advanced rate offerings and take advantage of investments in DERs to reduce bill impacts. You know, and we think, of course, of the DER trifecta of EVs, solar, photovoltaics, and storage technologies is coming together and providing, you know, a value stack that folks are beginning to take more and more advantage of. So the concern being, of course, those who are not participating and what we can do to encourage that participation, ensure that we're not creating greater levels of inequity in these markets. Conversely, we also find that, you know, lower income customers, of course, may experience a higher cost of service without additional benefits being added to that incremental cost of service accrual. So they're less likely to participate in behind the meter offerings, and yet they're more likely to pay more for the incremental costs that are displaced by the behind the meter customers, NEM customers, as they continue not participating in these offerings. So we have to be concerned about those cost shifts. We have to be concerned about rising cost of service in the new and advancing DER energy economy that we find ourselves in. Finally, we believe, based on modeling, that electrification, of course, should lead to lower household energy costs, and we know that to be true based on different scenarios for more aggressive GHG emissions targets. However, we know that upfront investments in electric vehicles and other DERs for low-income Californians can be a true barrier to participation, and that remains a concern. And so this is going to be a lot of ongoing work that we have to take seriously, that we have to kind of begin to proactively address in order to eliminate such inequities in our markets. Next slide, please. So just building on that set of talking points, I wanted to kind of provide some numbers here that we did share some of this in our recent rates en banc for those of you who attended that, but just wanted to kind of provide a little bit of additional context. We obviously see an accelerating trend with our 3 major investor-owned utilities in California for household energy costs for electricity, natural gas, and gasoline. One of the main drivers clearly is kilowatt-hour sales decline that is ongoing, has been going on for several years now, resulting from load departure as a result of behind-the-meter resources being invested in more heavily. In addition, you know, we sense that we know that rate sensitivity to large capital investments occurs for San Diego Gas and Electric in particular, but the other utilities as well. And you know, when it comes to San Diego Gas and Electric, one concern obviously is the composition of their customer base. Not as many commercial industrial customers over which to spread revenue requirement, and so when you see their rates in particular and their household energy costs in particular, it's on a sharper trajectory. But in general, the trajectory is rising rather precipitously when looking at the future of natural gas and gasoline in particular. And then, of course, when we run scenarios with a tapering of natural gas and gasoline over the next 10 to 20 years, we can see quite clearly that electrification is the right move from an affordability standpoint. So we know that will stabilize this trend that you see here. And of course, we need to find a way to ensure that in doing so and moving forward quickly into electrification, that we try to create equitable cost of service outcomes for all customers. Next slide, please. So just some other backdrop information here that some of us know, some of us don't, but DER growth and electrification is coming on the heels of some clear trends in grid conditions, which are rapidly changing. You know, recent doubling of rooftop solar, 3.5x, 3.5 times the growth in behind the meter storage, around 5.5 gigawatt hours of capacity there. You know, EVs are rapidly being adopted or shall be soon, and obviously the last presenter spoke of the 2035 sales goals that we have in accordance with the governor's executive order, and so that's where we're heading quite clearly and quite quickly. Building decarbonization is providing substantial growth in smart, flexible end uses, different smart devices, smart plugs, thermostats, water heaters, heat pumps. So all of this is painting a picture that necessitates rate designs and incentives that enhance system-wide, highly flexible load management for us. So we're laying the groundwork now for taking a deeper dive into this area of much more flexible system-wide load management, and we have to allow ourselves now to adopt more flexible optional rates and maybe even mandatory rates in some cases for larger customers that are going to enable and engender the kind of electrification, the kind of market for DER growth that we really want as quickly as possible, but keeping in mind, of course, the equity and affordability issues that I've been speaking about all along here. So next slide, please. So we have a vision, a unified vision of with increasing electrification, different EV rate offerings, and integrated load management strategies that are going to help facilitate this future. A menu of optional and mandatory advanced rates and demand response strategies that effectuate a more robust, dynamic, transactive DER marketplace and widespread load management on a more flexible basis than ever before. We want more effective demand response and retail rate strategies that are obviously enabled by long-term electrification, and we need to address very clear issues that still plague the system with regard to the duck curve and steep evening ramp and other grid constraints that are associated with the growth of renewables and electrification, and then obviously ongoing DER adoption. So these are particularly with the steep evening ramp, we know that there's a number of things that we can still do to help to reduce the peak, to lift the belly of the duck, to address the steepness of that ramp, and hopefully to make for a better cost-managed grid in the future that provides the kind of benefits to all customers that we seek to deploy. And so, within that rubric, within that framework, we also need to be promoting fair and secure compensation mechanisms and automation technologies in an increasingly transactive and bidirectional grid environment. We know that, of course, along these lines, that the CEC is recently in its rulemaking for Title 20 standards has moving forward with a ubiquitous real-time price signal will allow us to have the kind of prices to devices that we seek to ensure that in every household we can begin the process of giving customers the access to the wholesale rate information, the real-time pricing rate information that will be necessary as these kinds of rate options that we envision are designed and deployed around the state. And so we'll be working in concert with the Energy Commission, of course, in our own work to hopefully launch a new staff proposal and perhaps a new rulemaking in the future that, if assuming that the PUC wants to go in that direction, but we'll find out, to begin to establish this unified vision and to explore it in greater detail on the record and to work around these goals. Next slide, please. And so we see increasingly a call to action for real-time pricing, EV tariff options that are varied and reflective of the different complex environments within each of our major IOU territories, but that support this vision and provide a potential anchor in a declining kilowatt-hour sales environment. So, some of the challenges that we referred to earlier, of course, the steep evening ramp, but just in addition, reliability and stability challenges, both in terms of resource management and in IOU revenue stability. I mean, these are very real concerns. Along with IOU revenue stability, anytime you introduce suites of advanced rates, you run the risk of revenue shortfall, depending on how those revenues are managed. And so we need to be very clear-eyed about that. We need to ensure that we don't further exacerbate any kind of cost shifts that might be resulting from net energy metering that we're currently trying to address. So we have a lot of work to do, I think, about research and understanding through pilots and different policy forums to begin to address what it is that we think might need to be done to stabilize the system in that regard when it comes to revenue stability, when it comes to improved resource management. So renewable curtailment issues, along with the steep EV ramp, obviously, are a well-documented story here that we all know about and refer to quite often. Siloed and somewhat inefficient rate design and load-modifying demand response programs have, I think, plagued us a little bit in terms of a lack of synergy or a lack of vision for how these things come together and provide the type of load flexibility that we hope to deploy around the state in a more robust fashion. Managed EV load growth and incentives will be essential in containing cost of service increases. We know this. So again, this is just more of the same. It's really looking at how we can provide managed load growth and charging, understanding better how charging will occur on the grid in different use cases around the state as these incentives are provided. This all paints a picture of the need to address affordability challenges for the customers that might not be so inclined to join this electrification revolution with us. And so within that rubric, of course, we also need to be addressing arcane or outdated rate design structures. And so we're doing some of that, but we still need more work in that area. So for example, non-coincident demand charges are something that in the commercial tariff structures can be sometimes an impediment, perhaps, or may not provide for the full robust economic value of investments in DERs in terms of payback period that they should. So we need to explore more dynamic demand charge or fixed cost recovery mechanisms to ensure that we are, again, freeing up as much economic value as possible when it comes to developing a more robust DER marketplace and promoting electric vehicle adoption. We have a number of pilots that have been done around the state over the past several years, including vehicle to grid integration and the rates transactive energy pilot in SCE territory. We've done enough research around this to know that there's great potential here to move forward with more advanced rates that are going to support the EV culture, going to support a more dynamic grid in a bidirectional sense. So we need to, I think, continue to do that work and to build a record that's going to support making customers feel comfortable with the direction that we feel we need to move in, particularly small commercial and residential customers. Next slide, please. So within that frame, I think it's important to talk about a couple of the recent and ongoing implementation exercises that we're undergoing with regard to electric vehicle rate applications and decisions at the CPUC. So in decision 19-10055, we had a PG&E commercial electric vehicle rate implemented not that long ago, and so it's just a new commercial electric vehicle rate and the creation of a new class of customers that is choosing to take service on the rate. Subscription charges for metered in 10 kilowatt increments for customers with maximum demands of up to 100 kilowatts, and then 50 kilowatt increments for all other customers. And again, this is really just intended to promote commercial electric vehicle rate adoption. And this is a commercial electric vehicle adoption and rate incentives that promote the right kind of charging behavior and get people to enroll and to begin to evaluate in a more meaningful way what this is going to look like in the future in terms of different use cases that sprout from this. And then more recently, San Diego Gas and Electric rate for electric vehicle high power charging, EVHP, as we call it. Yet another new rate that is kind of a mirror image in some ways of PG&E's commercial electric vehicle rate, but with some wrinkles and nuances. Separately metered electric vehicle charging loads with aggregated maximum demands of 20 kilowatts or greater. That's just really kind of getting into the medium and above commercial sector. We're excluding single family residential customers with this rate. Again, just like PG&E's, we have a subscription charge, incremental metered 10 kilowatt increment for customers with maximum demands of 150 kilowatts. So a little bit bigger than PG&E's, and then 25 kilowatt increments for all other customers, just here in addressing the capacity subscription requirements that we think are going to make sense on an incremental basis for customers going forward. Next slide, please. And then currently we're evaluating a day-ahead hourly real-time pricing commercial EV rate pilot that builds on that last PG&E rate that we just spoke of. So what this really is that's still under consideration at the CPUC, but it's a rate rider that would replace current TOU generation rates on current schedules business EV 1 and 2, day-ahead hourly rate pilot for up to 50 participants, we think at this point. for participating BEV customers. This is really just it's a generation rate that would naturally be derived from CAISO's day-ahead hourly wholesale market, forecasted load and zero emission generation is really the idea here. Distribution transmission non-bypassable charges, or NBCs, would be the same as on the CEV rate that is currently in place. And this would address, I think, a need for an expanding menu of flexible rate options and just kind of really piloting behavior on rates such as this and getting us the kind of information we need. And in particular, it allows us to evaluate potential revenue shortfall and cost shift issues that may crop up in a more dynamic environment with EVs such as this. So I think this is great. This is something that we are, we're currently working on a record for. We had evidentiary hearings just this past week around this, and I think we have some work to do yet to kind of achieve a pathway to a decision. But I think this is probably in broad strokes moving in the right direction, depending on how we evaluate party comments and testimony, and move forward with a decision. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, and I guess, is that the last one? There we go, okay. So this is it, and I'll wrap up here just by saying that we know that we have a number of issues before we can begin to feel fully confident and comfortable going out with a broad menu of electric vehicle rates that make sense for customers at all levels, from residential to large commercial and industrial. We are performing a number of ongoing areas of inquiry from implementation of real-time pricing, as I was saying earlier, consistent with the vision that we have of the future of more advanced rates, a more advanced DER marketplace, and greater electric vehicles on the road. Some of the key factors, obviously, around uncertainty for revenue recovery and cost shifts. We're going to be exploring that very soon in a staff proposal. The nascence of certain customers supporting vendor networks and technologies, I think that's very much an open question still, even though we're encouraged by what we're seeing in the third-party market. And it'll just be interesting to be working with the Energy Commission on some of this to get a better sense of how that's going to open up going forward. And really, really critical, I think, community choice aggregator and other energy service provider participation, how that's going to look. I mean, voluntarily, I mean, what sorts of tariffs might the CCAs be willing to engage in around this? Because they're under a different regulatory paradigm when it comes to that. And so working in partnership with them to ensure that this vision for a more robust set of rates and a menu of rates that will ensure a greater adoption of EVs and DERs in general, and accommodate the kinds of grid impacts that we want to see happen. So we're looking forward to working with them to try to make that a reality in the near future, of course, as we have on the TOU side at the residential level. Other considerations that we're looking into around more advanced rates are the operational infrastructure flexibility and scalability of these types of solutions, and how we can count on different dynamic energy and capacity options across the board, concerns about resource adequacy in this more advanced environment, and ultimately hoping to result in a future wide-scale integrated unified load management strategy that is both optional and mandatory. Perhaps we'll see. We'll just have to wait and see how this all works out. Don't want to put the cart in front of the horse here, but we think we have a vision. We're working on it in the moment, and we look forward to partnering with everyone here at ARB and CEC on making this a reality as we embark very quickly into a future of electrification that is right upon us and requires great rates and incentives that are going to work for customers. So thank you for your and
all right, Paul, thank you very much. There was a lot there, and I think it's a very important conversation to have, so we appreciate it. All right, next will be Mark Wenzel, who's the manager of the Advanced Vehicle Infrastructure Office at the California Energy Commission. Mark will provide an overview of the Clean Transportation Program at the Energy Commission, including program performance to date and proposals for potential future investments. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Good morning, thanks. As Jordan said, my name is Mark Wenzel and I'm manager of the Advanced Vehicle Infrastructure Office. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. Apologies for being audio only. We had a software hardware incompatibility, but I suspect you'll be more interested in the slides than my video anyway. Next slide, please. Others have introduced California's transportation goals. Of course, those guide us at the Energy Commission as well, but I'd like to talk about the CEC's role in meeting them. The CEC is the state's lead agency on ZEV infrastructure and low carbon fuel production. Our primary funding source for this work is the Clean Transportation Program, created in 2007 and extended in 2013. Next slide, please. We have funded a variety of projects under the CTP. For this workshop, we've been asked to focus on ZEVs, but I do want to take note of significant investments in workforce and manufacturing and low carbon fuels. Within ZEVs, we've categorized our efforts into light duty EV charging, publicly available hydrogen fueling stations, and medium and heavy duty ZEV infrastructure. Over time, the focus of the Clean Transportation Program has evolved. In the early days, more focus on alternative fuels, now a growing focus on ZEVs. Within ZEVs, increasing attention and funding to medium and heavy duty vehicles in the last few years as the technology has evolved and become more accessible. And an ongoing and still growing focus on serving disadvantaged and low-income communities. Next slide, please. The Commission has adopted a commitment to inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. These are some of the ways that we're working to have that inform our decisions. Wanted to call attention to the last one, aiming for 50% of Clean Transportation Program funds to benefit low-income and disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. Just under half of our funding to date has been in low-income and disadvantaged communities, and we're continuing to look at ways to develop metrics of benefits to communities that go beyond the location of the investment. Next slide, please. I wanted to make a plug here for one of our data projects that we use to track progress. The CEC's ZEV data dashboard is the state's definitive source for ZEV data. I have it set here to EV chargers, but you see with the tabs at the top, we also have hydrogen stations, ZEV population, and ZEV sales. Most of these data are updated quarterly. This is an interactive map with lots of Easter eggs, so I recommend going and hovering over every number or county to see what pops up. Thank you. I didn't even have to ask for the next slide. Somebody's right on top of things. Turning to the next, first of the three ZEV categories I mentioned. Light duty EV charging. So we have a goal and executive order of 250,000 chargers by 2025. As you saw in the previous slide, we track existing chargers. We also monitor announcements of other investments, including utility programs, and forecast the impact of Clean Transportation Program investments. With all of those incorporated, we still see a gap of about 57,000 chargers. Although this may seem like we're most of the way there, that's not many fewer than the number we have installed currently. So there's a significant amount of work to be done to achieve that 2025 goal. Next slide, please. We've also looked ahead to the charging infrastructure needed to meet the goal and executive order of 5 million ZEVs by 2030, or the 8 million ZEVs in 2030 along the pathway to a 2035 target of 100% sales. In the latter case, we see a need for a total of about 1.2 million chargers by 2030. Next slide, please. So what is the CEC doing to facilitate success here? Our program and approach have evolved. In the early days, we had consumer rebates for home chargers, then a focus more on DC fast charging corridors, so that along major travel corridors, one would never be more than 25 miles from the nearest charger. And then we're in now a deployment phase to try to get rapid deployment to meet those charger targets. Our single biggest project is a charging infrastructure rebate project called CAL-EVIP. We have funded this at $193 million in CEC rebates and incorporated $36 million from local funding partners. Although not all of the regional projects within CAL-EVIP have launched yet, we're already at more than $250 million in oversubscription, which shows a high demand for rebates, but also the demonstrated ability to leverage public funding with private funding. CAL-EVIP will end at this level of funding, but we have issued a solicitation for a second block grant for light-duty EV charger infrastructure incentive projects. Solicitation is open now with applications due tomorrow. So if you are simultaneously polishing your application and listening to this, we hope that you get it in, and we look forward to seeing it. We've also had other targeted grants for innovation and technology or rollout. These have included ZEV planning blueprints, which are planning documents for local governments to lay the groundwork for ZEV adoption. Best Fit was a solicitation we proposed awards for earlier this year, which innovation and technology and business models. And then looking ahead this year, we have three more solicitations planned for infrastructure to serve ride hailing and other on-demand fleets, multi-unit dwelling residents, and rural drivers. So we see, as I said, we see ourselves still in this deployment phase. Looking ahead, we are planning to continue to increase our focus on equity and our harder to reach use cases as we look over time to hand off investment in mainstream charging infrastructure to the private sector. Next slide, please. One example of the focus on equity is the work under SB 1000, which requires the CEC to look at the distribution and access to charging. In our first report out late last year, we focused on statewide averages and found, among other things, fewer public chargers per capita in low-income communities than in medium and high-income communities. This year, we're advancing the analysis to look not just at statewide averages, but at helping to inform more targeted decisions. One tool we're developing is a drive time analysis, how long it takes to get from, in this case, a census tracts population center to the nearest public DC fast charger. Next slide, please. We've done this analysis statewide, and we think we can help this potentially target investments to serve drivers and DACs. On the left is the statewide map, and on the right is a zoom in on the LA area. You can see that even among DACs, there's some disparity in access to public DC fast charging. Next slide, please. The second of our three categories is publicly available hydrogen stations. These primarily serve passenger vehicles, but in the future, we see that some of these stations will also serve medium-duty and even heavy-duty fleets. The CEC has had a series of solicitations to support hydrogen station development dating back to 2009, with the most recent awards announced at the end of last year, totaling up to $115.7 million. With those awards, and also with the exciting announcement of a number of stations that will be opened without any CEC funding, we're approaching the 200 station goal for 2025, but have still identified a gap of 21 stations. Next slide, please. Our approach in hydrogen has evolved as well as it has in EV charging. One of the goals of the last solicitation was to help industry advance towards economies of scale. And you can see on the graph, the previous solicitation from 2015 is in orange, and the current, most recent one from 2019 with the results announced last year is in blue. The grant funding per station on a vertical axis is decreasing, and the capacity for stations is increasing. So we see some positive trends here. For the, next slide, please. The third of our three categories is medium and heavy duty ZEV infrastructure. Most of these are technology neutral investments, funding both hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, vehicle infrastructure, and EV charging infrastructure. One of them will be a block grant that will look in some ways like Cal EVIP. We also have blueprints, again, local planning for medium duty and heavy duty ZEV infrastructure. Incentives for transit. This project will have 2 EV and 2 hydrogen projects. Drayage truck and infrastructure pilot program, a total of $47 million in a unique partnership between the CEC and CARB, one BEV project and one hydrogen project here. School bus replacement program, and then with our research group here at the Energy Commission, a demonstration project for hydrogen fuel cells in rail and marine applications. We're looking for big air quality and benefits from these investments, and over time, CEC is proposing a shift in funding in the Clean Transportation Program to accelerate medium-duty and heavy-duty deployments. Next slide, please. So looking ahead to those future investments, in addition to the $95 million a year in projected clean transportation funding, the governor's budget this year proposes $3.2 billion to accelerate ZEV adoption. About $1 billion of that would be in infrastructure, and this breaks out the infrastructure piece. This would include enough funding for us to close the gaps in both the EV charging and hydrogen fueling for 2025. As well as additional acceleration of medium duty and heavy duty infrastructure. In addition to the infrastructure pieces, the proposal includes $200 million for in-state manufacturing and a significant amount of additional funding for vehicle incentives. The budget also proposes as an extension of the Clean Transportation Program beyond 2024, recognizing that our targets have to be interim targets on the way to greater ZEV adoption to meet California's climate goals. Next slide, please. For more information on any of the solicitations that I mentioned, past, present, and future, recommend a visit to the Energy Commission's solicitations page with the link here. Next slide, please. And for more information on the Clean Transportation Program, I recommend the annual investment plans. These are good sources of information on historical data, impacts, and also on future plans. Final slide, please. So thank you very much for your time this morning. I look forward to a good discussion and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. All right, last on our panel is John Thurston. And John is the chief of the statewide long-range planning branch at Caltrans. And John will discuss key reports looking into strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled across the state. John, take it away.
All right, thanks for having me. And I'm happy to talk on behalf of Caltrans and our parent agency, CalSTA. We'll wait just a minute while we get that slide back up. All right. And so the two plans I'm going to talk about today are the California Transportation Plan 2050 and the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, the CAFT. So we can advance to the next slide. So why VMT? Per the mobile source strategy, we know clean vehicles and fuels alone won't get us our needed reductions. Changing the way we travel, providing travel alternatives to driving, and managing demand for single occupancy vehicles are key to meeting our climate goals. Even with heavy adoption of ZEVs, the sale of new vehicles, per Executive Order N7920, combustion engines will remain on the road for decades to come. This means that in order to meet our climate goals, VMT reduction is necessary. If we want to solve the climate crisis equitably, we have to make sure that clean transportation options of the future provide more options and are more accessible and affordable than options of the past, particularly to BIPOC communities. We can advance to the next slide. So as a state, how do we plan for a transportation system that meets our reduction goals? The CTP 2050 is our federally mandated plan that encompasses federal, state, and regional efforts and builds on important work already completed by the department and our partners. The plan was developed in accordance with CTP guidelines, and it meets legislative requirements to demonstrate how the state will achieve transportation GHG emissions targets. For us, that's the 80% below 1990 levels. The CTP explores transportation strategies that promote equity, respond to current emerging trends and technologies. Sorry, a little tongue-tied this morning. Supports sustainable growth, increases safety and security, fosters healthy lifestyles, expands economic opportunities, and creates a transportation system that protects humans and the environment. The CTP is closely related to the CAPTI. These two plans share a common set of goals. And while the CTP has a broader vision for the transportation system, the CAPTI is focused on how to spend state transportation dollars on infrastructure in a way that supports those goals. So it really gets into that funding of infrastructure. We can advance to the next slide. So this is kind of one of the key takeaways from the CTP 2050. There's a lot of lines on here, but the ones to pay attention to are the blue line and the purple line. That blue line considers the previous scoping plan and shows where we'd hit emissions-wise, and that purple line shows where we'd get to with all the CTP's modeled strategies. That's things like congestion pricing, land use, transit and rail improvements, and it shows what we can do to move the needle with VMT in terms of VMT and GHG. And we did all these things, and we still needed an additional 5% ZVs above the previous scoping plan. So it really goes to show how far we need to go. Next slide, please. So as outlined, there are many aspects and recommendations on how to bring the vision of the CTP to life. One key component is how we spend our transportation infrastructure dollars. That is why Executive Order N1919 asked CalSTA to leverage state transportation spending. It asked CalSTA to align with the scoping plan, reduce VMT by directing investments in a way that supports infill development, reduce congestion by encouraging mode shift, fund infrastructure that encourages transit use, walking and biking, and mitigate for cost increases to lower income Californians. And all of this really does tie in nicely with the CTP's goals and the CAPT's goals. So these all come together in one nice package. We can advance to the next slide. After the Executive Order N1919 was released in September 2019, CalSTA, in partnership with Caltrans and other agencies, spent all of 2020 engaging the public and advocacy stakeholders. This led to the creation of the CAPT, which was released in draft form in March of 2021 and will be finalized by July 15th, 2021. The CAPT is a holistic framework for aligning state infrastructure investments. It's built on the foundation of Fix It First and includes proposed changes to the state transportation planning, programming, and mitigation activities. And we can advance to the next slide. So the CAPT has 10 guiding principles. These are designed to provide a vision for how investments should be prioritized. 7 strategies with approximately 30 actions are identified to start that initial work. And we'll get into a couple of the strategies in the investment framework. So if we could advance to the next slide. So 3 of the big investment strategies that are specifically called out in N7920 are focused around expanding clean transportation options. These include building an integrated statewide rail and transit network to provide seamless, affordable, multimodal travel options, incorporating safe and accessible infrastructure into projects to support bicycle and pedestrian options. And this is particularly in low-income and disadvantaged communities, and support light, medium, and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles infrastructure. And then we'll move into the next 7 strategies. So these other strategies here will help us meet the objectives of N1919 and are also important to meeting our climate goals. This includes reducing public health harms and maximizing benefits to disproportionately impacted disadvantaged communities, making safety improvements to reduce fatalities and severe injuries, addressing physical climate risk, promoting projects that do not increase passenger vehicle travel, promoting compact infill development, and develop a zero emissions freight transportation system, also protecting natural and working lands. And so on this, I really want to say thanks again for having me here, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer portion of this. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, John, and yeah, thank you to all of our panelists for those presentations. I'd now like to move us into the public comment portion of the agenda. And I'd ask that our panelists turn on their cameras if possible so that we can simulate kind of an in-person table or panelist table. I'd first like to invite representatives of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee to provide comments or questions. And then after that, we will hear from our other public commenters. So if I could ask our EJAC members to, if you'd like to speak, please click the raise hand button so our webinar facilitators can easily spot your name and your hand and unmute you. go ahead and click the raise hand button. That would be appreciated. So Maureen, do we have anyone from the EJAC that would like to speak?
Yes, I see Sharifa Taylor. Sharifa, I've unmuted your microphone. You'll need to unmute yours.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharifa Taylor. I'm a researcher with CBE Communities for a Better Environment. I first wanted to thank the panelists for their presentations, and I have two brief comments. First, I would like to ask when we do these type of workshops that the panelists include in their presentations, like a list of acronyms. Like I noticed that some of the presenters did it, but some of them didn't. And like people would refer to like these acronyms first before actually saying what the plan or project or whatever was. And so even though I was doing my best to keep up with it, it was something that was just difficult to follow. And so especially since this will be posted online, that would be helpful. Second, I'd like to say that low-income communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by and have suffered from adverse health impacts of fossil fuel operations, including tailpipe emissions for decades. Households and families that live in vulnerable communities on the front lines have earned the right to directly access and benefit from all forms of clean mobility options and clean transportation technologies first and foremost. California's clean transportation policies and investments must be designed with equity at the center. It is not only ethical to put equity at the center, but bottom-up clean transportation policies make economic sense and are the fastest way to electrify transportation in California, promote clean mobility options, and aggressively end our reliance on fossil fuels. I also wanted to say that CB is working with allies and advocating for these equity priorities in different regulatory processes currently underway at CARB, such as the Advanced Clean Cars 2 and other avenues. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sharifa.
Okay, Catherine Garupa White is also here. And Catherine, can you unmute your microphone? Oh, no, sorry. Okay, there, I think you can speak now.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Catherine Garupa White, the Executive Director for the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition and also a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. Thank you to all of the presenters this morning for this information and particularly for making sure that equity was mentioned and integrated into your presentations. You all are probably well aware that the San Joaquin Valley has a significant challenge when it comes to addressing mobile source emissions, not only because we're an incredibly vast region, but because we have a complex mix of rural areas, urban sprawl, and just generally a lack of mobility. So first, wanted to express strong support for the move towards full electric. I've been disappointed to hear that our air district, among others, have been actively promoting natural gas vehicles when we know that fully electric is really where we need to go. And also wanted to underscore the comments from one of the presenters, I believe the last presenter actually, that our transition to fully electric also can't just rely on everybody having electric vehicles and still driving around in single passenger vehicles. It's absolutely going to take coordinated land use and transportation planning. So a lot of what you all were discussing this morning was really music to my ears. Just a couple of points that I want to underscore with the equity lens. With the mention of infill, yes, critically important, and also important that we ensure that that infill doesn't cause displacement and gentrification. That's hugely important, and I recognize you're not necessarily in the land use business, but hopefully those conversations are actively happening between the transportation and land use agencies. Also, definitely we want to see biking and walking infrastructure, and we have to make sure that it's safe. So in the San Joaquin Valley, where we have, communities that were not designed to be safe for bikes or where we have heavily congested roadways where it wouldn't be safe for people to be biking or walking along those. Thinking about things like vegetative barriers, keeping people off the major roadways. I think some of the innovations that we've seen through processes like AB 617. And then maybe just a question for staff, perhaps this is coming this afternoon, but I did notice in the overall presentation that production and refining is included in the mobile source category, but we didn't have any presenters on that. So I'm not sure if it's because it's being covered in the electricity sector or where the production and refining piece will be covered. Anyways, thank you all again for the presentations and look forward to being in dialogue and offer myself as a resource for anyone who would like to discuss the challenges in the San Joaquin Valley particularly.
Thank you, Catherine. And I can speak to the refining and oil production emissions. Those will be covered at a future workshop as we talk about future scenario design. Thank you. All right, Maureen, do we have any more EJAC members that would like to speak?
No, I don't see any other members of the EJAC.
Okay. So let's move to hear public comments. So a reminder again for attendees, please use the raise hand button to indicate that you'd like to ask a question, and we will unmute you so you can ask your question or make a comment, and please state your name and affiliation before asking the question, and we'll be selecting people in the order that they raise their hands. And a reminder that you can also submit written comments through the public comment docket, and we'll be taking those through midnight on July 9th. All right, Maureen, let's kick it off.
Okay, the first person is Bill Zobel. Bill Zobel, I'm unmuting your microphone.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You hear me? You can? Okay. Thanks, Sam. I got the nod there. Appreciate that. So again, Bill Zobel with the California Hydrogen Business Council, Executive Director. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to comment. Great presentations today, gentlemen. Very much enjoyed what you had to say. There were 3 questions asked at the outset. Where should we be focusing public investments? How do we improve access to our disadvantaged and underserved communities? And then how do we generate supply? I think the panelists did a good job of trying to get after some of those. One of the comments I might make.
Bill, you've pressed the mute button. Can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
There we go. I'm sorry about that. I did that same thing yesterday. I'm not sure how that happens. So the scoping plan, I think, presents us an opportunity to look at things a bit differently.
Bill,
what I would encourage the folks that are working on the scoping plan to do is to take an aggressive look at some scenarios that look at an increased use of hydrogen and how those cross-cutting benefits of hydrogen can apply across sectors, not just transportation. There's a session this afternoon on power. There was, the opening session on Wednesday touched a little bit on a variety of different modeling exercises that are going to be done. But an aggressive approach, I think, that looks at what could be a very aggressive state posture towards hydrogen refueling infrastructure, hydrogen production, and just what that, what does that really look like? Is there an advantage there in going that route versus some of the routes that are considered, I think, more traditional and are being looked at currently by all the agencies? So just as one of the options, I think a good place to spend some public monies would be to look at options, and one of which being a high use of hydrogen case and how the cost of that might compare to other cases going forward. So I very much appreciate the presentations this morning. Look forward to working with all of you as we move forward with the scoping plan. Thank you.
Hi, this is Mark. I wanted to address that if I could just jump in, and that's to say, thank you, appreciate the comment. At the Energy Commission, we are also interested in a broader look at hydrogen. One of the things that we're doing is funding a UC Davis, co-funding a UC Davis study on the costs and benefits of a cross-sectoral hydrogen economy that looks at, demand considering not only transportation, but also industry, heating, ties with the electric grid and so forth, and thinking of it in terms of that scale. So appreciate the comment, and I think there's some action that we're already taking that might be in that direction.
The next person to ask a question is Julia Levin. Julia, I have unmuted your microphone.
Thank you, and good morning. This is Julia Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California. We strongly support the state's push to zero emission vehicles, but I think the presentation, particularly from ARB and also the governor's executive order, make clear that zero emission vehicles are not available in every vehicle class, particularly for the heaviest duty vehicles, which are the most polluting diesel powered vehicles on the road. In fact, they are the single largest source of air pollution in the San Joaquin Valley and the South Coast air districts. And I think the governor's executive order reflects the reality that we are unlikely to replace those dirtiest vehicles on the road with zero emission trucks much before 2045. And actually the executive order even acknowledges it may not be possible then by including the term, all heavy duty trucks must be zero emission in 2045, where feasible. That is a major gap in our clean air plans. So I think I totally sympathize with the groups that are pushing for zero emission vehicles, and we share that desire, but where they are not available or commercially viable, we do have an option that's available today, which is a 90% cleaner near zero emission truck. And when that truck runs on biogas from diverted organic waste or other organic waste sources, it actually can provide carbon negative emissions. So I think we all can agree that we want to see zero emission vehicles wherever possible, but where they don't exist or they're not commercially viable, we have a really good option in the meantime. And to subject another generation to diesel truck pollution is just unacceptable. So I don't think it should be an either or. I think everywhere we can, we should move to zero, but where we can't, we should not continue to buy new diesel trucks. We should buy near zero and require that it run on carbon negative or very, very low carbon biogas. I do also just want to say on a personal note, I bought an electric vehicle, an electric car a month ago. So I really, really do support the transition to zero. But most of the public fueling stations are unacceptably slow, or recharging stations. And so any public or ratepayer money that is spent on new charging stations going forward, I think really has to prioritize much, much, much faster charging stations. I think that is a huge barrier to expanding the deployment of electric vehicles. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. This is Sam Pornozeri, and I can speak to maybe the first part of your question and then pass it on to Paul or Mark with respect to infrastructure and electricity rates. So you have a really good point. I mean, long term, and I really appreciate your comment, long term, we need to really look at zero. I mean, that should be the technology we need to look at. In the near term, obviously, I mean, while we're seeing the zero emission technology, especially in medium and heavy duty sector, is rapidly evolving. Currently, our heavy duty vehicle incentive project vouchers provide incentive for almost 6 models of different heavy duty truck. I mean, those are tractors like drayage trucks. That includes like the new Volvo, the new, I mean, the Lion, I mean, or BYD, as well as some of the bigger manufacturers, including, I mean, Peterbilt or others that are providing the zero emission heavy duty trucks, like class 8 trucks in the zero emission space. However, I mean, as I noted in my slides, the way we're looking at the heavy duty sector, the technology mixes we're looking at heavy duty sector is we are looking at a long-term full transition to zero emission. However, in the near term, we're looking at clean combustion. Last year, our board adopted a regulation requiring almost 90% cleaner engines starting 2024 with a 0.05 gram per brake horsepower hour standards in 2024 to 2026, and then 0.02 gram per brake horsepower standards starting 2027. That is really to our commitment to have, I mean, a portfolio of technologies moving forward and have cleaner combustion, I mean, in the near term to ensure that we can improve air quality, to ensure that we can bring healthier air, especially in our communities, in our underserved communities, while at the same time doubling down our efforts to put us on trajectory for meeting our long-term zero emission targets that we have and is basically has been put into the executive order. So we appreciate your comments. I mean, we're definitely looking into that. There are a variety of incentive programs currently at CARB that look at such as VW mitigation funds or Carl Moyer that provides funding for low NOx natural gas in the near term to the point you mentioned, to bring early accelerated reductions in the near term, while in the longer term we do see a future with zero emission technologies being commercially available. I mean, infrastructure definitely needs to be ramped up to support that, to move toward, to meet our collective goals of climate, air quality, and community toxic risk reductions. I don't know if other panelists, Paul or Mark, if you want to add in terms of the infrastructure and electricity rate.
Hi, this is Mark. I'll jump in on the infrastructure piece. And Julia, thanks for the comment. You know, the charging rate is something that's an interesting challenge. It continues to evolve rapidly. One of the limitations is that there aren't yet many vehicles that take the very high charging rates, but we are starting to see some super fast chargers at rates of up to 350 kilowatts installed, and that, you know, monitoring that technology and making sure that we're funding things that have the best consumer experience is something that we're keeping an eye on. So thank you.
I was just going to jump in. Thank you, Julia, for those comments. I have to confess that I'm not as keen on the deployment of that infrastructure and keeping tabs on it as Mark is. And we have staff at the CPUC, as you're probably aware, that are probably a little bit more engaged with it, in terms of drayage trucks and larger vehicles that you know, and trying to get high power charging out there deployed more quickly and to take advantage of that. Obviously, we're trying to, in my shop, attempting to set up the rate structures and incentives for people to take advantage of these offerings. So it's a little bit of both that has to happen simultaneously. I appreciated your desire to get, you know, I really loved your plug on the negative emissions portion of this, and I think that this is something that we're going to have to explore in greater depth going forward. I know that staff that worked on the TEF and, you know, other areas of EV charging development within the CPUC are probably monitoring this much more closely than my staff is. But just wanted to say that definitely this partners well with the area that I spoke to around rate design and needing to make sure that we're putting out there the right tariffs, right options for folks to take advantage of, to go hand in hand with the infrastructure that needs to be deployed.
Okay, the next person is Evan Edgar. Evan, I have unmuted your microphone.
Hello, live from Sacramento, Evan Edgar for the Compost Coalition. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Yeah, I totally support the comments of Julia with regards to having a nearer-term heavy-duty solution. I'm in the refuse sector, the solid waste sector, and we cut across all boundaries of the scoping plan. When it comes to short-lived climate pollutants, that's SB 1383 over at CalRecycle. With CARB, we have to divert 75% of all organics from the landfills by 2025. And as you know, the landfills are super emitters of methane. And what we're doing, we're taking, instead of having that legacy landfill gas happen there, we're diverting it to anaerobic digestion in the urban sector. And we work with wastewater and standalone facilities to do anaerobic digestion, and we make a carbon negative fuel. Under the low carbon fuel standard, those fuels are carbon negative now. So we're deploying them statewide. We got grants from CalRecycle. This is happening today. It's not a dream pipe. It's not an electric hope of tomorrow. It is real technology today being deployed today by reducing short-lived climate pollutants today in the near term. Plus, we look at near zero NOx as a reality in the Central Valley. The San Joaquin Valley APCD is making a wise choice in order to promote near zero NOx vehicles today, because you have a NOx problem in the near term, not 2045 with some electric hope. We got to reduce NOx today. And the heavy duty sector can do that with the waste sector, with in-state RNG that's carbon negative, near zero NOx now, and we're deploying it. And we're on a way to doing it until CARB passed regulations for advanced clean truck rule that is really forcing our industry to stay on diesel for the next 18 years. We're on momentum in order to have carbon negative today, and with your rules at CARB and some of your rules and not having funding for CARB oil, look over here, look over at HVIP, there's no funding. We're talking in circles about potential funding with regards to near zero trucks. So we're in a quagmire. The refuse industry is 15,000 heavy duty fleets. We're committed to a carbon negative future. We're committed to near zero NOx now. We're committed to short-lived climate pollutants out of landfills, but we're making choices every day now to stay on diesel for the next 13 to 18 years when you guys are hoping on your electric dreams of tomorrow that doesn't have duty cycle, that doesn't have deployment, that have $10 billion cost of infrastructure. So the scoping plan cuts across all sectors. So look at short-lived climate pollutants along the way, and when we do that, we make compost and digestate, and we take all of that compost use to the working lands to sequester the carbon into the soils, which is another carbon negative solution. So you got to look at this holistically. The waste sector is not about landfills anymore. We're about making our own fuel in our own trucks, making compost for the working land. So please, as part of the scoping plan process, I'll be all over this for the next 18 months on behalf of the California Compost Coalition to have you guys have a holistic solution today, and don't put your dreams of tomorrow being carbon neutral by 2045 when we're a net zero 3.7 times in 2018, and by 2030 be 9 times net zero greenhouse gases. Using your math, using your technologies, using your terminology, we're doing this today. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan, for your comments. And we're definitely, willing to, have more conversation with the Compost Coalition and others in terms of the technology mixes, in terms of the, regulatory actions moving forward, and how it can definitely maximize both air quality and climate benefits in our state. Thank you.
Okay, the next question will be from Moses Stites. Moses Stites, I have unmuted your microphone, and you'll need to unmute yourself. Moses Stites. Okay, we'll move on to the next person, William Erdmans. William Erdmans. Sorry.
Hi there.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Hi, William Urbans here from Cargill. I'm an analyst. Quick question for both, I think, Sam and Mark. Was looking at the Energy Commission's view on electric vehicles by 2030, just seeing a disparity between that and CARB's figure. I think the low, looking at the Energy Commission's, was about 2.9 million vehicles to about 5.5 by 2030, and CARB's estimate being around 8 million, estimate and or required, I guess, to meet your goals by 2030. So I'm just asking, I guess, kind of where that disparity is coming from, how are these being projected, and maybe like what kind of sample actions would be required to get to that 8 million number that CARB has compared to the about the 2.9 to 5.5 from the Energy Commission. And side tangent, I also want to thank all the presenters today. It was a very good session this morning, so appreciate the time.
Thanks, William, for your comment. And I can speak to that 8 million. So originally, the governor's second ZEF target was about 5 million. I think it was around 2016 or 2015, 2016 timeframe where the governor Brown set a target of 5 million ZEVs in California roadways by 2030. However, later on, when we started working the 2020 mobile source strategy, and in line with the new governor's executive order of 100% of sales being zero emission by 2035, and by looking at the carbon neutrality targets, we ran different scenarios and new scenarios, which I was providing in one of my slides, which really showed for us to get to that goal of carbon neutrality, for us to get to ramp up to that 100%, we need to ramp up earlier. I mean, we're seeing the sales are growing in the electric vehicle sector, in the light duty sector, it's growing rapidly. And our new scenarios, which again, it's just a concept. They're not still regulatory requirements, but they're just a concept, are showing about 8 million vehicles. I know that as part of the AB 2127 effort that California Energy Commission took, I mean, they looked at both, scenarios for 5 million as well as the new 8 million zero emission vehicles that were mentioned in the 2020 draft 2020 mobile source strategy. And they did some assessments in terms of the infrastructure demand, number of chargers, the number of public chargers that are needed to support that. I can definitely point you, if you send me an email, or Mark, we can definitely point you to that report. Mark, please feel free to chime in if you have anything additional.
Yeah, thanks. I think, as Sam said, the 2127 report, which looks at the infrastructure needed to meet those targets, included both the 5 million in executive order and the 8 million needed to match the mobile source strategy. The other projections that you are mentioning, I think, are done by our demand analysis group, and those were completed before the governor's executive order. Those are regularly updated, so I would suggest keeping an eye out on the CEC updated projections as well. Thank you.
Okay, the next question will be from Tom Lent. Tom, I have unmuted your microphone.
Oh, thank you. This is Tom Lent. I'm a e-bike project manager for Walk Bike Berkeley. And I really appreciate Mr. Thurston's bringing out that ZEV cars and trucks will not turn over fast enough to meet our goals which are critical given the science. And hence we need to reduce VMT to make it more safe and practical for people to get out of their cars. And I want to suggest that e-bikes are an underappreciated ZEV tool to get people out of their cars. They've got great system benefits relative to electric cars. They're far more efficient per mile, excuse me, about 20 times more efficient. I've been getting about 1,000 to 4,000 miles per gallon equivalent in studies that I've done. Excuse me a moment. They're cheaper and faster to deploy. Got zero need for charging infrastructure, which of course is particularly challenging for the residential market. They've got virtually no impact on the grid, either overall or in time-specific loads, and they can start reducing VMT ahead of actually getting those gas cars turned over in the fleet. Similarly to other bikes, there's virtually no particulate emissions from the tires. They reduce congestion, reduce road damage, and vastly reduce pedestrian injury and deaths. And I think the VMT reduction potential is seriously underestimated from e-bikes, because they significantly expand the trips for which cycling is applicable. You can take longer distances, more hills, larger loads, including hauling kids. You can use them in hotter environments, so they're more applicable in the Central Valley and beyond. They're better in challenging traffic. Their increased acceleration gives more confidence and safety in challenging intersections. This is not a replacement for getting safer infrastructure for bikes, but helps us get VMT reductions while we're improving the infrastructure, which takes longer. And they reduce a lot of the other barriers to cycling, since they're easier, more fun, and more supportive of people with handicaps, and have greater potential to really address our equity issues. But speaking of equity, while they're way cheaper than electric vehicles, they're still expensive, particularly for low-income people. So we need a range of incentives. And I would urge us to think beyond e-bike share. E-bike share is very useful in specific areas, but e-bikes can work far beyond the dense areas that e-bike share really requires. And so long-term loans, low-cost leases, and purchase incentives are going to be important tools to get more e-bikes on the road and get the VMT reductions that we need. Thanks. I'd be interested to hear what kind of thinking you guys have been doing about that already, and we'd be happy to help you understand more of the potential that we've got. There's some really creative programs being tried elsewhere that we should be trying in California. Thanks.
Thank you. I also wanted to know that part of the thing with the e-bikes, we're quickly discovering every day. If you look at the previous iteration of the CTP.
John, one quick comment. Your audio is pretty muffled there. Would you mind switching speakers or trying a different method? It was fine before, so then changed.
All right, is that better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
All right. So with the deployment of e-bikes, if you look at the previous iteration of the CTP that was from 5 years ago, we didn't really have those in there. We didn't really have a consideration of them, and now we're continuing to build up our knowledge base on e-bikes and how best to deploy them. And so we're always interested to hear new ideas how we can integrate e-bikes or anything really that generates mode shift into our next plans. And we're really, interested in how these can tie in as a first and last mile connector, and really seeing where we can partner and push for new opportunities and new programs. So I think that's just kind of our general thinking on e-bikes at a high level.
Okay, then the next question will be from Stephen Jimenez. I've unmuted your microphone, Stephen Jimenez.
Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Is my audio okay?
Yes, it is.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Stephen Jimenez with the American Lung Association. Really, we appreciate today's discussion on cleaning up harmful air pollution from the transportation sector. And we view the 2022 scoping plan is critical to promoting healthy lungs for all Californians. We encourage CARB to place a high priority within the scoping plan for direct emission reduction programs in the near term to provide certainty and consistency in reducing harmful pollutants, especially in our most impacted communities. During the presentation, it was discussed that the transportation sector is the leading source of carbon pollution and by far the largest source of harmful smog-forming emissions. The Lung Association research shows that California has both the worst air pollution in the U.S. and has the greatest public health benefits to gain from zero-emission transportation. Within this frame, we strongly support the rapid transition to zero-emission cars, buses, trucks, and off-road equipment and fuels consistent with meeting our clean air and climate standards, including Governor Newsom's executive order N-79-20. In addition to rapidly electrifying transportation sources, we want to really emphasize that reducing VMT through targeted investments and coordinated state-level actions must also be essential to the scoping plan and consistent with Executive Order N-19-19. We really appreciate the inclusion of CalSTAs in today's presentation and urge CARB to work with state agencies involved in housing, land use, and transportation planning to ensure all state efforts are aligned to reduce VMT by building healthier, more sustainable communities built around active transportation, transit, and zero-emission mobility. We respectfully urge CARB to coordinate a clear roster of state agencies strategies that can be tracked and monitored to ensure we make progress on VMT reductions. And then finally, it's critical that CARB evaluate the health benefits of various pathways to support prioritization of health and equity as we design the plan. We very much look forward to working with you on this plan, and we'll provide further comments following the workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Really appreciate your comments. I mean, regarding the public health impacts of transportation, we totally agree. Transportation is one of the major contributors to both smog pollution and carbon emission, as well as the, diesel pollution within our communities. And that has been one of the core focuses of the modeling that we have done push the transportation sector to zero emission, to not only curb away the carbon emissions associated with that, but also to reduce the toxic emissions, as well as the smog pollutions associated with that. With respect to the VMT strategies, I mean, definitely partnership is a key aspects of partnership with other sister agencies, with local agencies and regional ones is a key to the success of our VMT reduction strategies. I mean, the mobile source strategy document, as you were heavily engaged with, lay out 8 different strategy areas that CARB is thinking for, I mean, in collaboration with CalSTA, Caltrans, and other transportation agency to take on in order to reduce VMT. And I totally agree with your point regarding, I mean, having metrics to track the progress of these measures and making sure that we are on the pathway for reducing VMT. As you heard from a couple of other commenters and speakers today, I mean, moving to zero emission alone is not going to solve the problem. We definitely need VMT reductions too. So appreciate your comments and engagement. Thank you.
The next question is from Robert Parkhurst. Robert Parkhurst, I've unmuted your microphone.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Well, first, thank you all. So my name is Robert Parkhurst, and I'm with Sierra View Solutions, a consulting company. Thank you first for all of the hard work on this. I know this has taken a lot of time and a lot of effort, and all of us in the community appreciate it. My question is pretty targeted. I was on some of the slides. It looks like there's a bit of a discrepancy, and so I'm just trying to understand. So on the first set of slides on the vision for zero emissions transportation, on slide 10, it states that 30% of cars will still burn gasoline in 2045. And then in slide 12, it says that 85% of passenger cars ZEV and PV in 2045. So that's double the difference. So I am confused at what the difference between those two are. Thank you very much.
Hi, Robert. Thanks for the question. I mean, definitely a right question. So the difference is because of the plug-in hybrids. On slide 12, I mean, we're saying 85% of passenger cars will be plug-in hybrid and pure ZEV, which includes hydrogen and battery electric, whereas on slide 10, the 30% that burn gasoline include plug-in hybrids. As you know, plug-in hybrid, depending on their charging patterns, etc., if they are in a charge sustaining mode, they start burning gasoline. So, I mean, as they move from their charge depleting, which is typically like full electric, if they are capable of, I mean, handling high loads, and as their charge depleted, fully depleted, they move to the burning gasoline. So that 15% difference between slide 10 and 12 is really the plug-in hybrids. Plug-in hybrids is part of our, I mean, has been part of our zero emission portfolio. And in the scenario we presented, they were part of the moving to the 100% zero emission vehicles. So thanks for the question and hope that clarifies it.
The next question will be from Shada Azamian. I apologize for mispronouncing your name.
No worries. Thank you so much. This is Shada Azamian. I'm with Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability based in Fresno. I want to thank you all for your work on this and thank the EJAC members who spoke and really want to uplift their comments that they made, particularly around how we primarily need measures that go beyond technology and look at the way communities are planned and what they've access to. For example, why are warehouses located right in low-income communities of color, especially in inland California, where there are fewer services, goods, grocery stores in lower-income neighborhoods, requiring residents to travel longer distances for basic needs and work. So really just want to underscore the need for coordination between transportation and land use to make sure we're reducing VMT by reducing the need for people to travel great distances. for their basic needs. I also want to urge us to exercise utmost caution with so-called interim stepped technologies, especially when these extend and keep building out expensive and long-standing polluting energy infrastructure. I noticed this kind of interim step language in I think the mobile source strategy presentation with the use of clean combustion and low NOx fuels and engines. So I especially want to make sure that the teams working on all these different low emission measures and framing have heard from impacted communities, because we've seen really little to no tolerance of any continued use, even of lesser polluting fuels in communities that still experience a scale of thousands of trucks going by their homes every day. So I'd be interested to see your agencies open up public discussion on the feasibility of the transition to complete zero emission trucks, and getting really into the specifics of that, because we've seen research saying that a transition to completely zero emission trucks is feasible, and want to make sure impacted community members, agencies, and industry alike are on the same page of what's the strongest action we can take here, given the true emergencies of climate and human health in the most impacted communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Shada. Those comments are right on point with respect to the transition to zero emission technologies. I mean, definitely we are, as I mentioned in one of the slides, we need to double down on the zero emission technology transformation as soon as possible. This is something that is definitely needed, especially for underserved communities and low-income color communities, communities of color, and etc. So while we are doubling down on those, I mean, last year CARB, the board adopted a regulation to start requiring manufacturers to sell zero emission vehicles, trucks, medium and heavy duty trucks in California. And this year, later this year, we're taking to the board a fleet regulation, which requires fleets who have the potential for early transformation, like last mile delivery, or higher priority fleets, such as, I mean, and public fleets, to transition to zero emission technology as soon as possible. So, however, in the near term, while we are making that transition, we also want to make sure that we do not continue having dirty diesel or older technology of combustion technology in California. So in parallel to that, we also adopted a regulation that requires the new combustion technology in the heavy duty sector to be as clean as possible, while we're making that ramp up of like from 0% sales of zero emission to 100% over the next decade. But thanks a lot for your comment and your points regarding warehouses and VMT reductions and making sure our land use plannings are designed in a way that reduce VMT is right on point. We agree with that.
The next question from John Sens.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, well, great. Well, thanks for having the comment period. I'm John Sens. I work at REG, or Renewable Energy Group. We're a large producer of biodiesel and renewable diesel. And I had two questions. The first one was how biodiesel and renewable diesel is integrated into the scoping plan. I heard no mention of it, and just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Just a point too on that. You know, biodiesel can reduce particulate emissions and local emissions by a large percent. And with certain feedstocks and improvements to our technologies, like the wind turbine that we put up at our Minnesota facility, we could reach near zero levels or negative levels for our fuel production and fuel gallon. So wondering how that fits into the plan, since we're able to reduce carbon today and not in the future.
Hi, John, this is Jordan. Thank you for the comment. Yeah, biodiesel, renewable diesel certainly play a role in as I mentioned in my presentation, displacing petroleum fuels in the existing fleet right now, and our low carbon fuel standard provides a premium for both of those. So those will definitely play a role.
Okay, the next question from Michael Carr. Michael Carr, if you can unmute your microphone. Oh, sorry, Michael. I think okay, are you
Can
there,
you hear
Michael?
me now?
Yes.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, turns out you have to unmute yourself in 2 different places. Good morning, everyone. Michael Carr with Carbon Neutral Consulting. I represent multiple clients on these kind of topics. First of all, thanks very much to all the presenters today, some very informative presentations. My questions will be to Paul Phillips. A couple of questions that I'd like to have him unpack if possible. Intrigued by a couple of bullet points. Bottom of slide 4, there's a comment about necessitating rate designs for system-wide highly flexible load management. At the top of page 5, there's a bullet point about a future leveraging a menu of optional and mandatory advance rates and demand response strategies. As ratepayers, particularly commercial fleet ratepayers, since we're speaking of transportation, what should they expect with details around what highly flexible load management would mean to running their business and mandatory advance rates mean to running their business? Just curious what folks are thinking there.
Can you hear me? Hopefully you can. Thank you for that question. It's a good one, and I want to first clarify that it really is putting the cart before the horse to declare anything mandatory on the advanced rates realm at this point. I want to kind of back up and explain where I was going in terms of the procedural steps that we're thinking of taking to provide for that. And so currently my staff and some other staff within the commission, the CPUC, are working on a white paper staff proposal that we hope will be recommending that the commission accept, which will offer direction in a new rulemaking that will be statewide for that vision, which is much broader than just electric vehicles. Obviously, it's about the DER context in general, but also taking a larger leap into more advanced optional rates to start with, to more widely deploy real-time pricing, in particular, dynamic and real-time pricing options, to have a more unified rate design process in California that will enable folks to take advantage of a vision that we are embarking upon, which is something that actually is more of a, we're calling it the Uniday vision. That's an acronym, but to get more to the point, it's intended to be a some way of having wholesale energy prices incorporated into, with geographic considerations, locational marginal pricing incorporated into it, so that we have a foundational rate for state and or utility territories, but then is sort of built up into locational characteristics. And so it's intended to be a blend of demand response and rate design, retail rate design strategies to get to more flexible load management in the future, all across the board, in a way that it hasn't been quite as successful in doing it a one-off and siloed basis across several different types of programs, both on the rate side and on the demand response or demand side management side. So that's the bigger broad background. I can't say for certain that anything's going to be mandatory anytime soon. I happen to think that at the larger commercial levels, that once we walk before we run in this direction, we can maybe potentially transition out of optional rates and make things more scalable, mandatory or default for certain types of customers. But I think that's a ways off, and so I don't want to commit to anything around that. That's just part of the vision. So what that means, I hope, really this is what I'm trying to get to as well, is that we can be optional for a while in these things, but we also have to have, if this is going to be a resource that we can count on, if we can look to advanced rate design as a way to reduce emissions, but also deal with better grid management strategies and to incorporate more flexible load management for EV owners, I think that it's going to require us to be thinking outside the box and to be committing to technological advancement that will support these types of rate structures. And so we need to assume certain things about automation technologies that are going to be in the home and in the business in order to engender that more fully. I don't know if I'm answering everything about your question, but do you have any follow-ups on that?
Oh, we have to move on to the next speaker. I'm sorry. So the next question will come from Sarah Deslaurier. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Yeah, no, it's Deslaurier. Thank you. So Sarah Deslaurier, I'm with the California Association of Sanitation Agencies and serve as their program manager for the climate change program and representing wastewater sector on climate change issues. And just wanted to, I guess, echo some of the comments that were made by Julia Levin as well as Evan Edgar with respect to, one, the Senate Bill 1383 push, right, for the diversion of organics from landfills to different recycling facilities like anaerobic digesters that at wastewater treatment plants, there are those that have been assessed by the State Water Board study on co-digestion capacity analysis as having excess capacity for that organic material. So we can co-digest it, produce that biogas. There's been incentives for that. And with that existing technology out there in terms of the vehicles that can use that biogas as CNG for, displacing that fossil fuel and for renewable natural gas use, that then, as Julian mentioned, really reduces quickly. And right now, the emissions from vehicles that are now diesel based and by up to that 90% that we've seen. And that's available right now, whereas there's some technology that just isn't available right now or within even the near future for the wastewater sector to use. But really thinking about not only this renewable biogas source, but also the resilience side of things and how the wastewater infrastructure and just providing this essential public service to begin, but also being able to provide critical response needs when there are these natural hazards or events that require some of these vehicles to launch, and even in remote regions that we need a reliable source of fuel and power for. And it's not just the miles that are traveled, right? It's also for the power that it needs to be providing for different infrastructure out there, pumping stations that go down and whatnot. And so, and also cleaning out different sewer lines to prevent backup of sewers and flows in different areas. So there's definitely a need for diversification and resilience related type of considerations with respect to, say, having not just electric vehicles, but maybe also CNG vehicles for those purposes. So really are hoping to coordinate and work and provide written comments too on these details so that we can sort through what's feasible in terms of a transition, but also resilience going forward for the essential public services. But that's my comment. So thank you for your presentations today. They've been great and really looking forward to working with you.
Thank you.
The next question will be from Colin Murphy.
Hi, so this is Colin Murphy from the UC Davis Policy Institute. Not so much a question as an observation and corroborating some of the material that the presenters from CARB put forward. And definitely want to compliment them on the good presentation and the strong overview they went into today. So the UC Institutes for Transportation Studies recently released a report titled Driving California's Transportation Emissions to Zero. It was a collaboration between 4 UCs. I led the fuels team work on there. And one of the things that we found in this study, which is very similar to what a number of the speakers have said, is that it is, I'm definitely not going to say impossible, but it is extremely difficult for kind of, an all ZEV framework to meet a lot of both critical near-term targets, like, getting transportation to a 40% reduction that sort of keeps it on pace to meet SB 32 targets, as well as some of the long-term goals to fully drive liquid fuels out of the system. Even if you assume and model a wide variety of additional policy support for ZEVs, just the fleet turnover rate is slow enough that it's really hard to make the numbers line up. So that puts the state in a position of having to make a number of decisions about what you're going to do to fill that intermediate term gap. And There are absolutely risks for things, like locking in infrastructure that's not going to be needed. There is also risks in the biofuel space of consuming too much and supporting land use change problems over the long run. But if you don't have some other measure to continue reducing emissions, a lot of those targets are just incredibly difficult to make and require assumptions that are probably just not feasible. So this is the kind of thing where myself and my colleagues at the UCITSs absolutely are eager to continue working on and to develop this set of strategies. It's going to require strategies that try to find the right balance, not too much, but not too little of these sort of bridge fuels or intermediate term strategies. And that's something that public policy often has a challenge on. Even though all the modeling and the research we did confirms that over the long run, ZEVs, predominantly electric vehicles, are going to be the dominant solution and the dominant technology that reduces greenhouse gas emissions to something like carbon neutrality. If you don't have something to fill in that intermediate gap, then you're either going to exceed your emissions targets or have to have a lot of fossil fuels combined with probably an unreasonable amount of negative carbon projects, which have their own risks and challenges involved. So look forward to continuing to work on this. I realize this is a long process. We're just kicking off. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, the next question from Mark Reist.
Hello. Yes, it's Mark Ruth, like Sure Canoe. And so the transition can go far faster than Colin just said, and then other people are concerned about. I want to suggest you focus public investment on technologies that are disruptive enough to harness capitalism's creative destruction of fossil fuels by displacing them in the market. Because renewable energy and storage are inherently modular and highly responsive to market opportunities, and because we are highly open to coordinating with government and ISO or other CPUC and other signals, we can prevent any disruptions of service due to fossil and nuke plant shutdowns. And also, we can beat the normal turnover. With this in mind, and knowing how fast our battery and solar can grow, we're asking that you run a parallel analysis based on conversions of vehicles in good condition. The technology for short to medium range truck and bus conversions to full battery electric vehicle is now ready to go. I know the guy who's got it, and he's offering to set up companies in production under license with something that is strong enough to help fully loaded Class 8 trucks go over Tehachapi Pass. We now have a concept for how to create a system for efficient disruptive conversions for light duty vehicles with community-based installation also. Financing at low rates and favorable terms will be key. Public banks and industry can facilitate this, so will energy as a service. How much time have I got left here? Do I have another minute or so? I don't hear anything.
Number of other questioners.
Okay. So I'd like to talk to you guys about that offline because I've got a very specific roadmap for getting there, and that includes charging infrastructure as well as the vehicles. And we've been working on this for years.
Okay, the next person is Teresa Bui. Teresa, you'll need to unmute yourself. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you so much for hosting this. My name is Teresa. I am the State Climate Policy Director for Pacific Environment. We are two of the few California NGOs with a consultative status at the International Maritime Organization, where we work to clean up shipping for the last 10 years. Ships are the next frontier for combating climate change. South Coast Air Quality Management Districts is expecting that NOx pollution from ships is going to surpass heavy-duty trucks by 2023. And ships are one of the worst air polluters in California, accounting for nearly 1% of the state's greenhouse gas pollution. So achieving the carbon neutrality by 2045 will really need to increase regulation of shipping sector. So would love to see an increase focus on it in the next scoping plan. Thank you so much.
Okay, the next question from John Sens. John?
Yep. Hello. So just my second question was around Executive Order 7920 and just to the executive orders in general. One thing I'd like to understand is there any legislation that's in the works to kind of solidify those proposals? Because one issue or one thing I fear would be that, you know, these initiatives that so much work's going into would be overturned by a future administration for somebody revoking the executive order. And I'm wondering how possible that is and if there's anything in the works to solidify these initiatives.
I mean, hi, John. This is Sam Pornazeri. I can take part of that question, and then it might be more helpful if you can reach out to us. I can put you in contact with our legislative director. I mean, as he's more engaged with legislatures in terms of the different actions that are going on. I mean, in terms of the executive order 79-20. So CARB is taking some actions. I mean, toward that. I mean, this year, as I said, we're taking to the board a new regulation for fleets, for medium and heavy duty trucks, to transition the medium and heavy duty fleets to zero emission. Next year, we are considering a new regulation on passenger vehicles. I mean, as part of our Advanced Clean Cars 2.0, which again, we're trying to be in line with that and solidify and taking solid actions to move the state toward the goals defined in that executive order. But feel free to reach out to me, and I can or any of the scoping plan staff, and we can definitely put you in contact with our ledge director on any other legislative actions.
Okay, the next question from Andrew Meredith.
Good morning, this is Andrew Meredith with the State Building and Construction Trades Council of California. Just a note on the sequencing of comments. If people are able to get on here multiple times before other people have already spoken, something's not working. But I wanted to first echo the sentiment of so many other speakers and thank you all for your informative presentations this morning. Just a couple of comments. I wanted to convey that in crafting the scoping plan, when we're addressing the expansion of California's infrastructure necessary to meet the aggressive 2045 goals, we strongly believe that consideration should be given towards a statutory engagement of skilled and trained workers to perform that work. The application of skilled and trained requirements on other forms of construction and maintenance work in California have already directly led to additional apprenticeship opportunities for Californians. To kind of tie that into the environmental justice front, consider that in our organization, 72% of our over 60,000 registered apprentices are people of color. We actively engage workers from the foster care system, previously incarcerated individuals, and applicants from some of California's poorest and most disadvantaged neighborhoods. I also want to make sure California balances the push for fully EV vehicles with a glaring lack of charging infrastructure in California's rural communities. The network has definitely expanded greatly in the last decade, but much more is needed in many parts of the state. That infrastructure is needed not just for passenger transportation in these areas, but also for heavy transport vehicles as well. Remember again that many of these communities tend to be statistically on the low to very low income scale. Some of them are also tribal areas with their own specific needs. We don't want to see these communities left behind as the efforts to meet the 2045 goals are implemented. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for those comments. This is Mark, just to jump in a bit. So I would also note that we do have under AB 841, which was passed last year, a requirement that CEC funded infrastructure be installed by electricians that include an EVITP which is Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program, with thanks to the first commenter for reminders about acronyms. That certification. So that is, one element of that. We also have a significant amount of funding in workforce development, and more on the way. And then in terms of the distribution of charging infrastructure, this is also something that we're thinking a lot about. Really appreciate the comment and welcome your engagement. I'm happy to talk more or to point to the specific proceedings. So thanks very much for those comments.
The next comment will come from Daniel Barrett.
Good morning, Daniel Barrett on behalf of Sierra Club, California. Thanks for the presentation and the opportunity to comment. We strongly support the comments made by the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition and Leadership Council, and believe that the state should only support 100% zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles. These vehicles are available today and are rapidly improving. Incentives can and should help with the upfront cost of zero-emission vehicles, and then the total cost of ownership will save operators money in the long run in avoided maintenance and fuel costs. Additionally, whether or not the state calls a carbon-based biofuel carbon negative, burning any of these fuels results in criteria emissions in communities that have been overburdened for far too long. The state should stop supporting interim measures like near zero vehicles as soon as possible and focus on getting only zero emission vehicles on the road in the requisite infrastructure and communities. Thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you.
Okay, the next question from Marianne Ferda. Marianne Ferda, yes.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you. I'm noting that it was necessary to unmute in two different places. Thank you very much for this very informative presentation and the excellent discussion that's followed it. I am a part of 350 Bay Area Active Transportation Team. In response to a comment that was made much earlier about the availability of zero emissions vehicles, just to say that you may already know, and if you don't, there is a bill that is now being considered in the California legislature, that's SB 372, that would provide for funding and assistance for zero emissions medium and heavy weight vehicles, focusing on equity. And the third thing that I wanted to mention is just to, following on John's comments, to increase focus and funding to and as support for active transportation and micromobility, especially in urban areas and for the economically disadvantaged population. So I wanted to send out a thanks to Tom Lent for his excellent input on this subject. John, I was not able to get your last name or how to contact you in future. So if you wouldn't mind to make that available to us, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Definitely. I'll share that with Jordan and make sure that it's amended onto our PowerPoint. My bad on that. And my contact information is john.thurston@dot.ca.gov. And once again, I'll include that and a list of acronyms in our PowerPoint for Jordan. And would also like to comment that, we're interested in making mode shift happen through our infrastructure involvements, and we're kind of interested in all of it, making it all work together with land use, with mode choice, and with our transit system. So.
Okay, the next question from Mikhail Skvarla.
Hi, Mikhail Skvarla with the Gualco Group here on behalf of the California Hydrogen Coalition. Again, want to express my appreciation for all the work that the presenters have done to get us here today, and look forward to the next 12 to 18 months working closely to develop a scoping plan that helps California achieve its climate goals, as well as reducing the impacts of air quality emissions. To that end, I think we've heard a number of things today that are intriguing, but I want to emphasize that a lot of this is contingent on a massive infrastructure exercise in the state of California. And we heard from Andrew Meredith with the building trades and others to that end. And with the 21-27 report yesterday, we see the scale of the charging infrastructure that's needed. We need to do similar exercises for the hydrogen fleet, both the medium, heavy duty and light duty fleets, to serve all Californians, including renters, super commuters, folks who live in older neighborhoods that lack the electrical infrastructure or may park on the streets where it's inconvenient to charge because they don't have a garage. We've heard a lot of conversation at the CEC and CPUC about vehicle to grid integration. Again, this is a place where hydrogen vehicles, especially in the heavy duty classes, could excel, especially in events of natural disasters. And we've seen that with a donation of Mirais to the American Red Cross that they're currently powering vaccination centers. And so to that end, I think we need to have a conversation that's holistic of all the zero emission vehicles in the fleet, and make sure that we do the planning to get the infrastructure on the ground prior to the 2035 deadline, prior to the 2045 deadline. And that includes a network statewide to cover both the charging and hydrogen refueling needs. You heard from Julie 11 the need for more fast charging. This is easily achieved with 1,000 hydrogen refueling stations to cover 94% of the population of the state and 97% of disadvantaged communities. We hope to work closely with the ARB, CPUC, and Energy Commission through the course of this to not only achieve California's goals, but also to enact policies that enable hydrogen in a way that was envisioned by Secretary Granholm's announcement this week of an earth shot to achieve $1 a kilogram hydrogen, which would beat the cost of diesel and gasoline and be cost competitive with charging. So to that end, look forward to this exercise and doing the modeling that's entailed, both the economic and environmental modeling, and look forward to working further with all the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick.
Okay, the next question from Nicole Rice. Nicole, there you go.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. My name is Nicole Rice. I'm the president of the California Natural Gas Vehicle Coalition. I first just want to say thanks to the speakers this morning for their presentations as well as their time today. Just wanted to kind of piggyback on some comments that have been made by previous speakers. But first I want to make clear that I believe everyone on this call is focused and committed to the state getting to a zero emission goal, including our coalition and the member companies that comprise it. But as you as the presenters this morning identified in your presentations, that this is a transition and that the transition will not be instantaneous. And during that transition, we are going to still have diesel and gasoline and other fuel types that are in use, especially in the heavy duty vehicle sectors. So we feel that it's short-sighted to reject the options for cleaner fuel that low NOx trucks fueled with renewable natural gas can provide. Because absent 100% electrification today, we will still have, as I said, those other fuel types on the road and in use. And as long as they are continue to be used, we will still have the undesirable air quality outcomes that we want to change. And so therefore, this is not about near zero versus zero. This is about near zero versus existing fuel types like diesel. The low NOx natural gas system already exists. As other speakers have said, it's already in use, and it is 90% cleaner than diesel. So if our policy goal is to reduce emissions and improve air quality for the millions of disadvantaged communities that are currently next to transportation and good movement corridors and are severely impacted by bad air, then we should not make a technology bias. Because as we recall, just not that long ago, the green diesel was the preference for getting us to a cleaner future. So we can let the science guide us, as we're seeing by data coming out of CARB regarding the zero carbon footprint that was talked about earlier before related to renewable natural gas, and continue to seek strategies that have a dual pathway of zero emission, which again, we support, but the near-term benefits of low NOx or near zero technology. Electric vehicles are going to be the best choice in the future, but today we should not bypass these cleaner technology options. Allow them to work in tandem to accomplish, again, our policy goal of cleaner air and better public health outcomes for the communities that need it most. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'd like to do a quick time check. Maureen, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay, we've got 2 left. The next one is Michael Wara.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I just had this is Mike Wara, Climate Energy Policy Program at Stanford University. I just had a clarifying question. The VMT reductions proposed in the plan are quite ambitious, and we all know that we've struggled to implement VMT reductions in the past. It's just a really tough problem, and I commend the efforts of ARB and Caltrans in trying to implement SB 375 and make progress on this critical issue for the state. I'm just curious how much of the target, the overall target for transportation or the overall target for the state is dependent on achieving that 25% VMT reduction. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michael. This is Sam Parnazari. I can definitely point you to, a couple of reports that CARB has published, such as SB 150 report, which talks about the progress is made so far, and also the 2017 scoping plan, which points out about the 25% VMT per capita reduction from a 2005 level. In the new mobile source strategy, the assumptions we've made by 2050 has been 15% reduction in VMT, which you can think about it as the 15% reduction in emissions, and in the bulk-to-tank emissions, because it's both going to reduce fuel production as well as the fuel consumptions. That comes from the VMT reductions on the passenger side, which by far is the biggest sector in the transportation side with respect to GHG emissions. But in terms of like the overall contribution, we can definitely, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can point you to relevant documents that points out how much we're getting from the zero emission transformation and how much is coming from the VMT reductions. We can definitely dissect those for you.
Okay, the next question from Sasan Sadat. Sasan, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much. Sasan Sadat with Earth Justice. Okay, well, I just want to provide our concerns on the transportation sector, but also thank you so much to all the presenters. Basically, we have 2 overall concerns. First, that CARB's 2030 climate goals, the state's 2030 climate goals, since they're set for 40% reduction targets, are still not aligned with the science-based interpretation of meeting the 1.5 degree scenario. And the effect this has, of course, is diluting the need for near-term action. And then the second concern is that CARB's key regulatory efforts in its rulemaking schedule now are not aligned even with those targets that are too weak. So we're backloading our efforts for targets that are already backloading the need. And the presentation from CARB didn't really underscore what CARB itself has acknowledged, that the current regulatory push under ACC2 for the passenger vehicles and under the Advanced Clean Truck and Fleets rules don't actually align with CARB's mobile source strategy. And again, the mobile source strategy is more conservative than the other pathway scenarios from like E3 and others. And in our view, the solution is obvious. We just need the starting points for these regulations to be significantly stronger. So for example, on the passenger vehicle sector, we're already seeing a dramatic surge in EV sales in Europe following the strengthening of their CO2 standards. And now France, Germany, and the Netherlands have all overtaken California's position. They're all already above 10% EV sales. And BNEF says Germany is going to hit 40% ZEV sales by 2025. And yet CARB is proposing currently to set its ZEV standards under the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule below its projections for business as usual. And I understand the logic is to go easy on the manufacturers while they transition, but the climate crisis means we can't just set market following standards, especially when we know manufacturers can meet them. So other climate leaders now are proving that more stringent sales schedules propel zero emission vehicle sales. And that has a significant impact on the overall fleet population we're going to have to live with in the 2030s. And, you know, this was just a comment about the passenger vehicle sector, but it's really a similar dynamic in the heavy duty sector with the advanced clean truck rules and the advanced clean fleets rules that are, you know, setting regulations that we know are below the identified need in the mobile source strategy. So we really need the scoping plan to come up with a serious proposal for how we're going to make up the deficit. And I think CARB will come to the same conclusion that we have come to, which is that the current rulemakings on its schedule right now, ACC2 and the Advanced Clean Fleets rule, need to find ways to strengthen early action and set earlier targets much higher because we know that's feasible. Thank you.
Thanks, Hassan. Just to add a point regarding the upcoming regulations such as ACC2 and ACF and the targets we're setting in the mobile source strategy. Your comment, I mean, was well received. However, I also want to mention that achieving our technology mixes that are laid out in the 2020 strategy is not only dependent on regulatory approaches. It's really a portfolio policy approach that we're taking at the state level, combining incentives and regulatory programs and other programs we have, such as consumer education, etc., to bring those technologies on the road. While the regulations are facilitating and are making sure are solid actions and make sure those technologies will be demonstrated, will come to the market and will commercialize as soon as possible. There's a need also for other, programs and other policy levers to make those technologies available and get us to those mixes that are needed in future. But thanks a lot for your comments.
All right, well, looking at the time, I think it's time to close the Q&A. So thank you to everyone who submitted comments. I thought it was a good discussion today. I want to give our panelists a chance to give closing remarks before we wrap up the workshop, if you'd like. Go ahead and jump in if so.
I'll hop in first then. I just really wanted to emphasize our commitment to reducing GHG emissions through our projects and through our partnerships. That includes everyone on this panel. That includes the public. And I wanted to emphasize the department's commitment to equity. And I kind of want to point to our new strategic plan that also includes a section on equity and the new office, our core office, which is the Caltrans Office of Equity. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for having me too.
And I'll jump in really quickly and thank everybody for inviting me here. I feel like I'm among an amazing crop of speakers and a great number of questioners that came forward today. And just wanted to say that we're going to have to work very closely in partnership with ARB and obviously the CEC as well, and just moving forward with trying to provide the right pricing incentives for EV users to move forward and to create a more successful environment that's going to be mindful of better grid management, better load flexibility, and as John was just suggesting, better equity in the state and making sure that we're incorporating environmental and social justice principles at every turn in rate design for the electric sector, but also as we continue deploying infrastructure going forward for charging facilities and getting into the right neighborhoods in the right parts of the state and doing it quickly as is feasible. So thank you again for the invite, and this is a great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. This is Mark, and I would just echo John and Paul. Many thanks for the invitation. Echo again our commitment to the state's climate goals and to equity, and also to partnerships, not only with the folks represented here, but also with all of the stakeholders who called in and those we haven't heard from yet. Every piece of this is that we talked about today is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot that underlies all of it in terms of the regulations and incentive projects and other pieces. A lot of work for all of us to do, but we really welcome the opportunity to do that and welcome the opportunity to partner with you in doing so. Thank you.
And I will also echo, the rest of the panelists. Partnership is key for achieving our goals. Not only at the state level, but also at local and with industry and other stakeholders. So I really appreciate stakeholders' engagement on our transportation planning efforts. Our transportation planning is, as I mentioned, is really targeted to making sure that not only are we going to meet our climate and air quality, but also bringing cleaner airs in our communities, especially disadvantaged and low-income communities, as soon as possible. Definitely that requires, work at the state level, as well as, with industry and other entities to make sure that we are on the right path for achieving those goals. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate, all the comments and questions. And if we were not able to answer any question, definitely feel free to reach out, to CARB, to scoping plan team and others for further discussion.
Great. Well, I want to again thank Sam, Paul, Mark, and John for their excellent presentations and engagement with our audience today. Really appreciate it. You did a great job. Thank you. Let's go to the next slide. As we wrap up here, I just want to cover the timing for the scoping plan and a few logistical items if you haven't seen this slide yet. So AB 32 does require that the scoping plan be updated every 5 years, and so the statutory deadline to bring the plan before the CARB board for adoption is the end of 2022. So the timeline here depicts the major milestones that we're planning around to meet that adoption deadline. Now, following this week's kickoff, there will be many more opportunities, this is just the beginning, to engage in the development process through scoping plan workshops and environmental justice advisory committee meetings and community meetings being planned for this summer and ongoing through the next year. It's going to be busy. We are working toward release of the draft scoping plan in spring 2022 for a 45-day comment period, followed by the first of our 2 board hearings, and then a release of the final scoping plan in fall 2022 for proposed adoption by the board by winter 2022. Next slide, please. And you can find today's presentations on the scoping plan meetings and workshops webpage. So again, I want to thank our panelists who did a phenomenal job, and thank you also to the members of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee who gave their perspectives, as well as the rest of our stakeholders. Thank you so much for the thoughtful comments and questions, and you've given us a lot to continue to think about. We look forward to further engagement over the coming months and through the next year as we map out the state's path to carbon neutrality. So with that, have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you back at 1:30 for the electricity sector workshop. Thank you.